The millionaire's son had only 1 day left, but the maid's poor son did the impossible. The world can change in a single day. Sometimes, it doesn't take miracles made of gold, it takes hearts made of kindness. It was a quiet morning in Los Angeles, the kind of morning where the sun rose shyly between glass towers, and the air smelled faintly of hope and exhaust. Inside a mansion on Mulholland Drive, the silence was thick. You could almost hear the sound of sadness breathing in the hallways. In a room lined with expensive art and machines that hummed softly, Ethan Carter, the only son of billionaire Richard Carter, lay on a hospital bed brought home at his father's request. He was only 12 years old, pale as the sheets that covered him. Doctors had said there was nothing left to do. A rare heart condition, one that had silently grown worse, had left him with just 1 day left to live. The city outside kept moving, unaware that time was slipping away for a little boy who had once laughed so loudly that the walls seemed to dance. Richard Carter sat by the bedside, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "You're strong, Ethan," he whispered, though his voice cracked under the weight of lies. "Daddy's here. We'll find a way." But there was no way. Money had failed him, something that had never happened before. Downstairs, the sound of clinking dishes echoed faintly. Maria, the housemaid, was washing the breakfast plates. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning. She had worked in that house for 6 years, ever since her husband died in a construction accident. Her son, Diego, often came after school to help her with chores. That morning, however, Diego wasn't there. He was sitting on the back steps of their small apartment in East LA, holding a letter from his school. It was about a science competition he dreamed of joining, but he hadn't been able to pay the entry fee. He sighed and folded the letter carefully, the way you handle something too precious to crumple. Then his phone buzzed, a message from his mom. "Be ready. Mr. Carter said you can come by. Ethan wants to see you." Ethan and Diego had met once by accident, when Maria brought her son along on a day she couldn't afford to leave him home. Ethan, fragile but curious, had asked him to play a game. Despite their worlds being miles apart, they'd become unlikely friends. Ethan loved Diego's stories about life outside the mansion, how kids played soccer in cracked alleys, how his mom made the best empanadas, how they found joy even when things broke. Now, Ethan wanted to see him again. When Diego arrived, Maria led him upstairs. The house felt heavy with silence. He stepped into Ethan's room and froze. The boy looked smaller, weaker, but his eyes lit up when he saw him. "Hey, Diego," Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm glad you came." "Of course I came," Diego said softly, pulling a chair close. "You promised to show me your telescope, remember?" Ethan smiled faintly. "It's right there." He pointed toward the window where the telescope stood, facing the morning sky. "But I can't move much now." Diego's throat tightened. He wanted to say something cheerful, but the sight of the machines and wires stole his words. Instead, he gently turned the telescope toward the sky. "Do you know what I see?" Diego said after a moment. "What?" Ethan asked. "A sky that's too big to fit inside our problems." Ethan chuckled weakly. "That sounds like something my dad would say if he wasn't so sad." Later that afternoon, as the golden light filled the room, Ethan spoke again, barely audible. "I wish I could see the stars tonight, Diego. From the hill. You know, the one near your house. The old observatory hill?" Diego asked. "But, you can't leave your bed." "I know," Ethan said, a tear slipping down his cheek. "It's stupid. I just want one more night under the stars." Diego sat in silence. Something inside him stirred, a wild, impossible thought. He glanced at the machines, the tubes, the monitors. Then at the boy who had become his only rich friend in a world that didn't mix with his own. Maybe it wasn't impossible. That night, after Maria finished her shift, Diego stayed behind under the pretense of helping her carry supplies. But his real plan had already formed. He had seen a small, portable heart monitor among the equipment, something designed for short movement under supervision. When Mr. Carter left the room to take a call, Diego approached Ethan. "Do you trust me?" he whispered. Ethan blinked. "With what?" "I'm taking you to see the stars." Ethan's eyes widened. "You can't. I'll die if." "You'll die if you don't live," Diego said, his voice shaking. "Please. Just this once." It was madness. It was reckless. But in that moment, both boys understood something that adults sometimes forget: life isn't measured by length, it's measured by moments that make it worth living. At 11:30 p.m., the mansion was asleep. Diego carefully wheeled Ethan out of the room, using the small oxygen tank and monitor. Maria would have stopped him, but she was already home, exhausted. They slipped through the garden, into the night. The city below sparkled like a sea of diamonds. Diego's bike waited by the gate. He had borrowed a neighbor's old wagon, cushioned with blankets and strapped securely. "You ready?" Diego asked. Ethan smiled weakly. "I've never been more ready." The journey was slow and fragile. The streets were empty, and the wind was cool. Diego pedaled, sweat glistening on his forehead. Every bump made him hold his breath. He checked the monitor every few seconds. Ethan's heart was weak, but steady. At last, they reached the hill, Griffith Observatory, closed and silent at night. They climbed halfway up, where the stars spilled across the sky like spilled sugar. Diego stopped and knelt beside the wagon. "We made it." Ethan's eyes widened as he gazed upward. "It's beautiful." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need words. The stars reflected in Ethan's eyes, and for a brief moment, he didn't look sick. He looked infinite. "I used to think rich people had everything," Diego said quietly. "But maybe, they just have more stuff." Ethan chuckled softly. "My dad says money can fix anything. But it couldn't fix me." "Maybe it wasn't supposed to," Diego replied. "Maybe you were meant to fix something in him." Ethan turned his head, tears glistening. "You think so?" "I know so." Hours passed. The city slept. Diego watched as Ethan slowly drifted off under the stars. The boy's breathing grew faint, but peaceful. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Diego whispered, "You did it, buddy. You saw the stars." Ethan didn't reply. A single tear slipped down Diego's face as he realized his friend was gone, gone with a smile, under the same sky he'd always wanted to touch. When the police found them hours later, they didn't know what to think: a billionaire's son lying in a wagon, wrapped in blankets, and a poor boy beside him, holding his hand. Maria came running, crying out her son's name. Richard Carter arrived minutes later, pale and trembling. He froze when he saw his son, not in a sterile room surrounded by machines, but in the open air, his face serene, the sunrise kissing his cheeks. There was no anger. Only silence. Then, as Diego looked up, terrified, Richard Carter fell to his knees beside him. You gave him the stars," he whispered. "Something I couldn't buy." He pulled Diego into his arms and sobbed. For the first time in his life, the richest man in Los Angeles felt poor, until that moment, when love made him rich again. Weeks passed. The story spread everywhere: the millionaire's son and the maid's boy. People shared it online, on TV, in classrooms. Some called Diego foolish. Others called him brave. But everyone agreed, he had done the impossible. At Ethan's funeral, Richard stood beside Maria and Diego. He placed a small telescope on the grave. "He used to say the stars made him feel alive," he said softly. "Now, he's one of them." Then he turned to Diego. "I want to fund your education," he said. "Not as charity, but because my son believed in you. Diego's voice trembled. I didn't do it for that, sir. I know, Richard said, smiling faintly. That's why you deserve it. Years went by. Diego grew up, studying astrophysics, ironically, inspired by the boy who loved the stars. He worked hard, often late into the night, and every time he looked up at the sky, he whispered, "You still there, Ethan?" He became one of NASA's youngest engineers, helping to design telescopes that could see farther into space than ever before. At the observatory hill, a plaque was placed under the stars. It read, "For Ethan Carter, who saw the stars on his last night. And for Diego Alvarez, who showed the world what love can do." Years later, an older Richard Carter stood on that same hill, holding a small child, his granddaughter. "That boy," he said, pointing to the plaque, "was my son's best friend. He taught me that money can build houses, but kindness builds heaven." The little girl looked up at the stars, her eyes wide. Did they really go there together? Richard smiled. Yes. And one day, when you look up, you'll see them shining back. Moral of the story. The world doesn't remember the size of your bank account, it remembers the size of your heart. Diego had nothing, yet he gave everything. Ethan had one day left, yet he lived more in that single night than most do in a lifetime. Because in the end, miracles aren't about defying death. They're about defining life. Through love, courage, and compassion.